Do you remember the Christmas party foods that made every 80s holiday feel brighter and somehow slipped from memory? Each platter once filled homes with laughter, color, and the smell of something special. When did simple party food stop feeling like celebration itself? Cheese ball towers were monuments of the 1980s holiday pride, standing tall in shimmering pyramids of cream cheese, herbs, and chopped nuts. Every family had their secret mix: cheddar, pimento, or maybe a hint of Worcestershire, rolled by hand and dusted with parsley until they gleamed like edible ornaments. They sat proudly in the middle of buffet tables, surrounded by buttery crackers, celery sticks, and laughter that carried from room to room. Guests would chip away at them through the night, reshaping the tower until it looked like a melted snowman of cheese and memory. The clink of cocktail glasses, the glow of tinsel, the hum of Bing Crosby on vinyl. These were the sounds that went with every bite. The cheese ball tower was never about fancy ingredients. It was about the ritual of gathering, of making something by hand and watching it disappear as conversations warmed. It was creamy, crumbly, and nostalgic in every sense. By the end of the night, only crumbs and a few broken crackers remained, proof that it had done its job. A 1980s Christmas party was not complete without it. A glittering tower of comfort, joy, and unapologetic excess, sitting proudly beside the punch bowl like an edible memory of merrier times. Shrimp cocktail rings were the crown jewel of every 1980s Christmas spread, a shimmering circle of elegance straight from the freezer aisle. Arranged neatly on crushed ice, tails curled in perfect formation, they sat beside a cup of tangy red cocktail sauce that burned just enough to feel grown up. Every host knew presentation mattered. The ring had to sparkle under the dining room light, framed by lemon wedges and sprigs of parsley. It was seafood made accessible, a touch of class on a plastic tray. Kids whispered about how fancy it felt to have shrimp at home, while adults dipped and chatted like movie stars from a commercial. It was the decade when convenience met glamour, and nothing embodied that balance like shrimp cocktail. The taste was cold, sharp, and addictive, a bite of briny sweetness followed by the burn of horseradish. It was both luxury and nostalgia, a dish that told you Christmas had officially arrived. Even after the party ended, that empty ring on the counter felt like a badge of success, the sign of a host who knew exactly how to make the night sparkle. Mini quiches were the bite-sized miracle of 1980s Christmas gatherings. Tiny, flaky rounds filled with creamy eggs, cheese, and dreams of sophistication. Lorraine with bacon, spinach for the vegetarians, ham for the hearty eaters. Each flavor promised a little indulgence in one neat golden circle. They came straight from the freezer, popped into the oven, and emerged smelling like warmth itself. No one cared that they were store-bought. They were tiny, perfect, and endlessly refillable. Stacked on silver platters beside crystal glasses and paper napkins shaped like poinsettias, they represented effort without exhaustion. Party guests hovered around them, spearing one after another with toothpicks as conversation flowed. Each bite melted in the mouth, buttery and delicate, a little piece of comfort dressed up as luxury. They were the edible soundtrack to the 1980s, efficient, elegant, and just a little indulgent. By the time the tray was empty, the room felt lighter, the laughter louder, and the memory sealed in butter and pastry. 7-layer dip was the Tex-Mex miracle that made every 1980s party table complete. Built in glass dishes so everyone could admire its colorful stripes, it layered beans, sour cream, guacamole, salsa, cheese, olives, and tomatoes, like edible art. It was food you could see, food that invited curiosity before you even picked up a chip. The first scoop always broke the clean pattern, but that was part of the fun. By the end of the night, it looked like a joyful mess of color and taste. Every ingredient brought its own story: canned refried beans for thrift, guacamole for trendiness, shredded cheese for comfort. It was multicultural celebration in a casserole dish, bold and unapologetically 1980s. Kids loved it for the color, adults for the spice, and everyone for the ease of it all. It turned any table into a fiesta, even under twinkling Christmas lights. In every creamy scoop was proof that food could be both casual and festive, both homemade and easy. A perfect symbol of its time, Pigs in a blanket were pure happiness wrapped in crescent dough. Little cocktail sausages tucked into golden pastry, brushed with butter, baked until puffed and warm. No appetizer vanished faster. People hovered near the oven just to grab them fresh off the tray. You could hear the laughter and smell the nostalgia before they even reached the table. They were the snack that broke down barriers, eaten by everyone from kids in footy pajamas to grandparents sipping eggnog. The texture was soft yet crisp, the taste salty, buttery, and deeply comforting. Each one disappeared in 2 bites, followed by that inevitable reach for another. You could dip them in mustard, ketchup, or nothing at all. They were perfect either way. In a decade obsessed with convenience and joy, pigs in a blanket delivered both. They were bite-sized celebration, proof that the simplest things are sometimes the most unforgettable. Crab rangoon was a touch of exotic elegance in the 1980s suburbia, a golden fried triangle filled with cream cheese and imitation crab. It was the kind of dish that made people feel worldly, even if it came from the local supermarket freezer. Fried crisp and served on shiny platters, it crackled when bitten, revealing a creamy center that felt like luxury. The flavor was sweet, savory, and unfamiliar enough to spark conversation. Guests would nibble and nod, declaring it different but delicious. It symbolized a decade of culinary adventure, when American kitchens flirted with the flavors of the world without ever leaving home. The sound of laughter mixed with the crunch of pastry, and soon the platter would be empty, save for crumbs and conversation. Crab rangoon was the 1980s version of daring. A little risky, a little indulgent, and always worth remembering. Spinach artichoke dip in a bread bowl was cozy luxury, bubbling hot under the glow of Christmas lights. The smell alone, garlic, cheese, and cream, pulled people from across the room. Served in a hollowed-out round loaf, it was a dish made to be shared, torn apart piece by piece. The bread edges soaked in the dip, turning every bite soft and rich. It was a meal and memory rolled into one, the kind of appetizer that made people gather close. Each spoonful felt indulgent, yet familiar, like comfort disguised as sophistication. It was the warmth of the 1980s kitchen captured in a single dish, cheesy, creamy, and endlessly comforting. It proved that hospitality didn't need polish, just heart and plenty of melted cheese. By the end of the night, all that remained was an empty crust and full stomachs, a quiet testament to the decade's love for food that brought people together. Stuffed celery with pimento cheese was the quiet classic on every Christmas platter, the kind of snack that looked simple but carried decades of tradition. Crisp celery sticks piped full of bright orange filling, creamy and tangy with just enough bite. They added color and crunch between the heavier party foods, a fresh reminder of old-fashioned charm. Every Southern aunt and Midwestern grandmother had their version, made from memory rather than recipe. They were made early in the day, chilled, and served cold, a bright contrast to the richer dishes around them. The sound of celery snapping was as much a part of the holiday as the clink of ice in glasses. It was a dish that didn't try to impress. It simply belonged. In a sea of dips and fried treats, stuffed celery was balance, texture, and a taste of generations past. Cold pasta salad with Miracle Whip was the every woman's dish of the 1980s, bright, colorful, and unapologetically creamy. Spiraled noodles tossed with diced ham, peas, and shredded cheese, all bound by that sweet, tangy dressing that tasted like summer disguised as winter cheer. It came in a pastel Tupperware bowl, carried proudly by aunts who knew it would be the first side to disappear. It was easy, cheerful food, the kind you made with what was in the fridge and never worried about proportions. Each forkful tasted like laughter, like the freedom of potluck meals where nobody judged and everyone ate twice. The coldness was refreshing, a welcome break from the heavier dishes, and the sweetness of the dressing tied it all together. It was a salad that never aimed for perfection, only satisfaction. In the heart of the 1980s, that was enough, and that is why we still remember it. Party meatballs and grape jelly sauce were the soul of every 1980s slow cooker. The recipe was simple: frozen meatballs, grape jelly, and bottled chili sauce. But the result was magic. Sweet, tangy, and sticky. They were impossible to stop eating once you started. The pot sat on the counter, bubbling quietly while guests arrived, filling the air with temptation. People hovered nearby, spearing one after another with toothpicks, pretending they were just tasting. It was the dish that defined 1980s entertaining. Easy, reliable, and delicious beyond expectation. Kids loved them, adults loved them, and even the host loved them because cleanup was a breeze. The glossy sauce coated every bite in nostalgia, reminding everyone that food didn't need to be complicated to be loved. Party meatballs were proof that sometimes the most unexpected combinations, like jelly and spice, made the best memories. Vienna sausage kebabs were pure 1980s creativity on a stick. Tiny canned sausages skewered with cubes of pineapple and glossy maraschino cherries, arranged in patterns that looked more like decorations than food. They sparkled under kitchen lights, the kind of kitsch that made every buffet feel like a celebration. Sweet, salty, and a little absurd, they balanced nostalgia and novelty in each bite. You could find them at office parties, church socials, and every Christmas Eve potluck, standing proudly on styrofoam displays covered in aluminum foil. There was something endlessly fun about eating food on a toothpick, and these kebabs knew it. They were the kind of appetizer that didn't take itself too seriously, just joy, convenience, and a flash of color. Kids loved them, adults pretended not to, and everyone reached for seconds. In a decade obsessed with presentation, Vienna sausage kebabs proved that even the simplest ingredients could feel festive when dressed in red and gold. By the time the party ended, all that remained were empty skewers and sticky fingers, a sign that whimsy never goes out of style. Jello molds with fruit suspended inside were edible art, shimmering in every color imaginable. They jiggled proudly from crystal bowls or ring molds, the crown jewel of every 1980s Christmas buffet. Cherries, mandarin oranges, or even canned pineapple slices floated like tiny ornaments inside. No holiday was complete without one, bright, wobbly, and full of personality. The first slice always drew gasps, the gelatin parting perfectly to reveal its jeweled treasures. It was the era's definition of beauty in food, fun, futuristic, and perfectly impractical. Children stared in awe, adults smiled with nostalgia, and every spoonful tasted like the sweetness of celebration. Sometimes it was made with whipped topping folded in for extra fluff, or layered by hand in stripes of green, red, and gold. No one called it refined, but everyone called it festive. Jello molds weren't just dessert. They were sculpture, history, and a little taste of magic on every holiday plate. Ham and cheese pinwheels were a host's best friend, rolled, sliced, and ready before guests even arrived. Thin deli ham wrapped around a spread of cream cheese, sometimes with green onions or pickles for bite, all cut into perfect spirals that looked fancier than they were. They sat on platters like edible ornaments, pink and white with swirls of nostalgia. The taste was familiar, simple, and addictive, a mix of salty, creamy, and cool. They fit the 1980s ideal of effortless elegance, the kind of dish that impressed without stress. Moms made them by the dozens, sealing each roll tight in plastic wrap before chilling them overnight to slice the next morning. They appeared at every gathering, from office potlucks to living room parties, always vanishing first. Pinwheels were proof that simplicity could still sparkle under holiday lights. In a decade of abundance, they were the perfect bite of comfort, balanced, nostalgic, and endlessly satisfying. Velveeta and Rotel dip was molten gold in a bowl, the unofficial fuel of every 1980s Christmas game night. Just 2 ingredients, Velveeta cheese and a can of Rotel tomatoes with green chilies, melted together into pure, creamy bliss. The slow cooker sat at the center of the room, bubbling away as guests hovered with tortilla chips in hand. The smell was sharp, salty, and irresistible. Every scoop stretched into strings of melted cheese, the kind that made you laugh mid-bite. It was cheap, it was easy, and it was absolutely beloved. There was no pretense, just comfort in its simplest, most glorious form. People gathered around it like it was the hearth itself, dipping, laughing, and wiping hands on napkins shaped like snowflakes. No dish captured the 1980s party spirit better: communal, casual, and a little over the top. Velveeta and Rotel dip didn't just feed people, it brought them together. Ritz cracker canapes were elegance on a budget, a chance for suburban hosts to feel like caterers. Each buttery round carried a crown of cream cheese, smoked salmon, or a slice of olive, perfectly portioned and camera-ready. The contrast of textures, crisp cracker, creamy spread, salty topping, was irresistible. They were arranged with precision on silver trays, sometimes sprinkled with paprika for flair. Even the simplest versions looked beautiful under twinkling lights. Guests would pick one up, laugh about how fancy they were, and reach for another. Ritz canapes were 1980s ingenuity at its best: small, smart, and endlessly adaptable. You could find them in every home, from modest kitchens to grand dining rooms, because they required nothing but imagination and a box of crackers. They proved that hospitality didn't need luxury, only love and a little cream cheese. Chex Party Mix, homemade and fresh from the oven, was the heartbeat of 1980s gatherings. A blend of wheat, corn, and rice squares tossed with butter, Worcestershire sauce, and spices, baked until crisp and golden. It was poured into big wooden bowls, filling the air with the scent of toasted cereal and butter. Every handful tasted different, some salty, some garlicky, all delicious. People munched it while opening gifts, watching television, or playing charades. It was snack food made personal, better than anything store-bought. Making it was half the joy. Shaking the pan, checking the oven, tasting for just the right crunch. Every family had its own twist: extra peanuts, more pretzels, or even a touch of cayenne. Chex Mix wasn't glamorous, but it was real, the taste of laughter and long nights spent together. No 1980s Christmas felt complete without it. Mini sausage stuffed mushrooms were the gourmet secret weapon of 1980s hosts. Button mushrooms, hollowed out and filled with spicy sausage, breadcrumbs, and cheese, baked until bubbling and golden brown. The smell alone made guests drift toward the kitchen. They looked elegant, tasted rich, and felt like something straight from a restaurant menu. Each bite was a burst of flavor, savory, creamy, and satisfying. They were proof that you didn't need training to cook something impressive. You just needed an oven and courage. The host would serve them proudly on a platter, smiling as they vanished within minutes. For many families, these mushrooms were the first fancy appetizer they ever made. They turned ordinary kitchens into holiday showcases and small moments into memories. Stuffed mushrooms were where ambition met comfort, perfectly baked and perfectly 1980s. Taco salad trifle was the ultimate 1980s showpiece. Layers of lettuce, spiced beef, cheese, salsa, and crushed Doritos stacked in a glass bowl like edible confetti. It was part meal, part decoration, and fully beloved. Every layer told a story of color and crunch, a fusion of convenience and creativity. The Doritos gave it a neon orange glow that fit the decade perfectly. People admired it before eating it, marveling at its brightness. The first scoop was always a little chaotic, but that was part of the fun. It wasn't about precision. It was about plenty. This dish embodied the optimism of its era: fun, fearless, and a little loud. The crunch of chips, the spice of taco meat, the cool tang of sour cream, it was impossible not to smile. Taco salad trifle wasn't subtle, but neither was the 1980s. It was the taste of joy layered high. Holiday cheese fondue was a holdover from the 1970s that refused to fade away. The fondue pot sat proudly on the coffee table, filled with molten cheese that bubbled like treasure. Cubes of bread, apple slices, and even little sausages were speared and swirled through the gooey gold. It was messy, interactive, and endlessly fun. Laughter filled the room as someone dropped a cube and blamed it on the wine. The glow of the pot warmed the air, turning a snack into an experience. Fondue was about participation, about togetherness in its most delicious form. The cheese stretched in ribbons, the smell filled the room, and time seemed to slow. It was one of those rare dishes that demanded attention and rewarded patience. Even as trends changed, fondue remained a symbol of 1980s hospitality, warm, welcoming, and wonderfully communal. Cocktail rye with cream cheese and caviar was the 1980s dream of sophistication, a small-town attempt at luxury served on napkins printed with gold snowflakes. Tiny rectangles of dark bread topped with white cream cheese and dotted with black caviar, proof that anyone could feel glamorous for a night. Guests leaned in curiously, unsure whether to take one, until someone brave did and declared it surprisingly good. The contrast of salty and smooth, rich and cool, was unforgettable. For a moment, every living room felt like a five-star restaurant. It was indulgence reimagined, wrapped in thrift and hope. Even if the caviar came from the grocery store, the feeling was real. It captured the 1980s dream, aspiration, creativity, and a touch of make-believe. Each bite was a celebration of what it meant to host with heart, to create elegance from imagination and turn ordinary nights into something special. Ham-wrapped asparagus spears brought elegance to 1980s Christmas parties without ever needing effort. Each stalk was blanched until tender, wrapped in a thin layer of salty ham, brushed with butter, and baked until the edges crisped. They looked delicate on silver trays, lined up like edible ornaments. You could find them at office parties with punch bowls and tinsel, or at church gatherings where casseroles filled every table. Guests would grab them two at a time, laughing as grease glistened on napkins. The combination was simple but powerful: the salty bite of ham, the earthiness of asparagus, the warmth of the oven. They were the kind of food that said, "grown up." Yet everyone from teenagers to grandmothers devoured them. Sometimes a drizzle of hollandaise turned them fancy. Sometimes just a sprinkle of black pepper made them shine. It was the decade's idea of effortless sophistication, refined but reachable. Every host who served them knew the secret. It was not about complexity, it was about confidence. Ham-wrapped asparagus spears were holiday charm on a plate, one perfect bite at a time, embodying the 1980s love for elegance that came straight from a can or freezer, yet somehow still felt like magic. Pineapple cheese spread was the heart of the retro appetizer table, a creamy mix of cheddar, crushed pineapple, and pecans that somehow made perfect sense. It was sweet, tangy, and just rich enough to feel special, shaped into balls, logs, or even molded into Christmas trees and wreaths. Served with buttery crackers, it was the snack people hovered near while waiting for dinner. Its tropical flavor gave a flash of sunshine to winter gatherings, a small rebellion against the cold. The texture was smooth and crunchy all at once, melting slowly as the pineapple's sweetness cut through the salt. This was the 1980s idea of creativity: fun, colorful, and slightly extravagant. You could find it on every family's best china, sitting proudly beside celery sticks and olives on toothpicks. It carried warmth in every scoop, laughter in every bite, and a kind of holiday cheer that no one took too seriously. Pineapple cheese spread was proof that joy did not have to be perfect. It just had to be shared. Swedish meatballs in cream sauce were the classy cousin of the grape jelly variety, rich and velvety, filling every kitchen with buttery warmth. The sauce, thick with cream, broth, and a hint of nutmeg, coated each meatball until it gleamed. Served with toothpicks or over egg noodles, they were the cozy middle ground between dinner and indulgence. The dish brought a little European flair to suburban America before anyone knew the name IKEA. Hosts loved it because it felt sophisticated but required nothing more than a slow cooker and patience. The smell alone drew guests closer, that perfect blend of savory and creamy that said, "The holidays have begun." Every bite was rich, tender, and comforting, a reminder that good food could travel the world and still feel like home. Swedish meatballs were 1980s perfection, warm, dependable, and secretly glamorous. Holiday cheese logs with almond coating were edible jewelry for every buffet table, Smooth blends of cream cheese, shredded cheddar, and seasonings were rolled tight, then coated in toasted almonds or herbs for sparkle. They were chilled, sliced, and served with crackers, each round a tiny portrait of holiday cheer. Some logs came speckled with dried cranberries or shaped into festive trees, others stayed classic and golden. Either way, they were a sign of care, the kind of food that required time but gave back joy. Guests hovered with knives, spreading the creamy mixture onto crisp crackers as carols played. There was always something deeply comforting about its simplicity, soft cheese, crunch, and nostalgia. It represented the 1980s perfectly, rich, colorful, and just a little over the top. In a decade of big hair and bigger appetites, the cheese log reigned supreme as the ultimate party indulgence. Cocktail franks and barbecue sauce were the sticky soul of any 1980s Christmas gathering. They simmered in slow cookers for hours, the sweet smoky scent filling every corner of the house. Made from nothing more than cocktail sausages and bottled sauce, they somehow managed to taste like home. People would gather near the pot, spearing them with toothpicks, each bite warm and addictive. It was the food of laughter and conversation, casual enough for a family gathering, yet loved enough for a corporate one. The sauce clung thickly, the flavor sweet and tangy with just enough spice to make it memorable. By midnight, the pot was always empty, the bottom sticky and scraped clean. Cocktail franks were proof that even the simplest recipe could feel festive when shared. They were bite-sized happiness, a tradition that never went out of style because it never stopped bringing people together. Spinach puffs were buttery little miracles. Flaky pastry squares filled with spinach, cream cheese, and dreams of sophistication. They puffed up golden in the oven, sending out a smell so rich it felt like comfort dressed in evening wear. Each one disappeared in 2 bites, creamy inside, crisp outside, perfectly balanced. They looked fancy but came straight from frozen pastry and pantry staples, a hallmark of 1980s brilliance. You could find them on every holiday table, from office buffets to family reunions, neatly stacked on platters beside mini quiches and pigs in a blanket. They were the kind of food that made you feel proud to serve, the kind that made store-bought taste homemade. Spinach puffs were elegance within reach, warm, flaky, and unforgettable. They turned ordinary kitchens into banquet halls and made even the simplest host feel like royalty. Sweet and sour meatballs glistened like ornaments in their glossy red glaze, a dish that looked as festive as it tasted. The sauce, made from vinegar, brown sugar, and ketchup, was bright, tangy, and addictive. Every bite was a perfect mix of savory and sweet, soft meat and sticky coating. They were cooked in big pots or bubbling slow cookers, always disappearing before dessert. Guests loved their balance of comfort and flair, that mix of home-style heart and party energy. You could smell them from the hallway, that sweet tang announcing celebration. They were the kind of food that stuck with you, both literally and in memory. The glaze clung to every bite, leaving that telltale shine on fingers and napkins. Even the smallest serving could fill a plate with warmth, laughter, and conversation. They were the life of the table, the centerpiece no one wanted to admit they came back for twice. Sweet and sour meatballs were not just food. They were the feeling of being together, of sharing something simple that somehow tasted like joy itself. No holiday table felt right without them. They were pure 1980s spirit, unapologetically bold and joyfully indulgent. Mini pizzas on English muffins were childhood magic turned party food. Kids loved assembling them, spreading sauce, sprinkling cheese, adding a pepperoni or 2, while parents loved how easy they were to serve. Baked until bubbly, they filled homes with that irresistible smell of tomato and toasted bread. They came out crispy at the edges, gooey in the middle, the perfect blend of snack and nostalgia. At family Christmas parties, trays of them disappeared faster than anything else. There was joy in their simplicity, a comfort in knowing exactly what you were getting. You could make a dozen in minutes and watch them vanish in seconds. Each bite was warm, familiar, and full of laughter, the kind of food that carried stories across generations. They were made with love and eaten with joy, proof that childhood never really leaves the table. Mini pizzas weren't fancy, but they were honest, fun, fast, and filled with love. They were the heartbeat of every casual 1980s get-together, a reminder that joy often comes in small, cheesy packages. Ambrosia. Rum balls rolled in cocoa or coconut were the secret indulgence of 1980s grown-ups, tucked onto dessert trays beside cookies and fudge. Made with crushed vanilla wafers, cocoa, corn syrup, and a generous splash of rum, they packed a punch in more ways than one. Dusty with sugar or coconut flakes, they looked innocent until the first bite told the truth. The flavor was deep, dark, and warm, holiday cheer in miniature. They didn't need baking, just mixing and patience, and that made them all the more appealing. At every office party or family gathering, someone always whispered, "Careful, they've got real rum in them." Laughter followed, and another one disappeared. Their sweetness lingered, both on the tongue and in memory. They were mischief baked into tradition, boldness wrapped in nostalgia. Rum balls were rebellion in confection form, grown-up, daring, and perfectly decadent. They tasted like grown-up Christmas, a little wild, a little classy, and impossible to forget. Sometimes things just get old, and sometimes they just don't work. We've had our fair share of both, and scones with clotted cream and jam are a bit of a mix of the two. Now, US and UK cuisines don't generally tend to mix, even though we've had lots of crossovers in the past now. Scones with cream and jam, at least these ones that would use clotted cream, were the quintessential British snack. If your idea of John, 32 from West Virginia, is somebody in plaid or flannel getting real intimate with a hot dog, then your idea of Martin, 28 from Birmingham, is somebody in a blazer enjoying a scone. It's just what we associate with the people, you know? These scones were something that immigrants from the UK brought on over with them, and don't get me wrong, in their parts of the country where there would be large British-American presences, it definitely was something that got a lot of mileage. In other places, it just wasn't really that much of a hit, and clotted cream wasn't really something a lot of people had access to. Kind of a bummer when your core ingredient ends up being in short supply for the masses, but maybe this one staying a niche secret is a good thing. I'm not the biggest scone fan after all, but this is all about you, so how do you feel about this little treat? Cream of wheat, on the other hand, is a pretty classic cereal that was made using wheat flour, but you had to grind this to hell and back for the dish to work. Hot cereals as a whole were a little bit more popular in the past than they are today, but lots of things have kept up, and that's why it's still a presence today. You have things like oatmeal hot cereal, which is pretty much people's go-to nowadays thanks to the massive health benefits. I mean, how many YouTubers do you really need to see with thumbnails and clickbait titles about how oatmeal solves every modern medical issue of the 21st century? Or how many Instagram reels from gym bros analyzing the nutritional value? Everyone knows how good it is, and cream of wheat doesn't have even half the same pull in that regard. It's good for getting your carbohydrates in, but that's pretty much it. Plus, the feeling of eating cream of wheat cereal is a little too close for comfort to porridge, which is a texture that you don't see anymore in modern dishes. Mocha whip cakes were more so the next hot thing in 1978 and started out as a niche trend particular in French-American restaurants. Young adults, book readers, and the romanticizing cafe-going types would always order a slice with their coffee of the day. Gold does not stay hidden in the dumpster for too long most times, and for these whip cakes that was the case. Mocha whip cakes went mainstream when more magazines began featuring them in the breakfast sections as chic and classy breakfast for the modern working adult. Advertising can go a long way, especially when it is targeted at you with the intent of making you feel special, but eating this cake did feel special. In America, it was hard for coffee lovers to find a coffee chocolate cake that did it right, and this was it. You can imagine the grief they had when it stopped being served in the usual spots past the 70s. Relemon juice bottles sat quietly in the pantry, but they worked wonders. Those green glass bottles were Grandma's secret weapon for glazes, lemon bars, and punch bowls. She said a splash of lemon made everything honest. It balanced all the sugar of December. She would twist off the cap, pour just enough into her bowl, and the whole room would smell brighter. It added sparkle to cakes, depth to frosting, and tang to her famous holiday punch that had people guessing the secret ingredient for years. Relemon made even the simplest desserts taste thoughtful. Grandma never waited to buy it because she knew one bottle was never enough. It was her silent helper, her bottled sunshine, the flavor that kept her kitchen glowing through the coldest nights. Cornbread dressing with sage was love served hot, a taste of the South, timeless and sacred. Scalloped cabbage was the farmhouse miracle that turned thrift into comfort and simplicity into celebration. Heads of cabbage were sliced, boiled until soft, then layered into a buttered dish with milk, flour, and crumbs before being baked to perfection. The top browned into a crusty layer, while the inside turned creamy and delicate. The scent that rose from the oven was quiet but comforting, a promise of warmth on a cold day. Each bite blended sweetness, salt, and cream, the humble cabbage transformed into something rich and gentle. It was food born from care, made to stretch what little the pantry offered. Farmers' wives passed it down through generations, teaching that love was measured in time, not luxury. Served beside roast ham or potatoes, it filled the table with modest grace. Scalloped cabbage was the memory of hard winters and soft hearts, a dish that spoke softly but lingered long, reminding everyone that simple food can hold the deepest kind of beauty. Lamb might seem like a fancy restaurant thing these days, but back in the day, it was a total dinnertime MVP. Lamb stew was a fan favorite at dinner parties back in the day, and I get the hype. Imagine the combination of melt-in-your-mouth lamb and an assortment of colorful vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and peas simmered in a rich, flavorful broth just begging to be soaked with some crusty bread. This is a dish that's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out on a chilly day. Not to mention, it's surprisingly easy to make. Perfect for those nights when you want a delicious meal without spending hours in the kitchen. Just maybe don't tell your grandma you added a sprinkle of your favorite hot sauce. Some traditions are best left untouched. Marble pound cake loaf from Sara Lee was the kind of treat Grandma kept in her freezer like a secret. It was never for everyday eating. It was for surprise company or when she just wanted something to go with coffee. The swirls of chocolate and vanilla looked too perfect to be store-bought, and that was the beauty of it. You could thaw it in minutes, slice it neatly, and serve it on her favorite china like it had come straight from the oven. The cake was soft, buttery, and comforting, a quiet luxury that made even the simplest visits feel festive. Grandma loved that it never failed her. Always the same, always delicious, always ready. In a decade full of instant mixes and boxed meals, this one carried pride. It was her emergency dessert, her Christmas standby, her frozen reminder that hospitality never had to wait. Chestnut puree was quiet elegance spooned beside a roast, smooth as velvet and sweet with the memory of smoke. Chestnuts were roasted, peeled, and mashed with butter, cream, and sugar until the mixture turned golden and silken. The flavor was gentle yet complex, nutty, faintly caramel-like, touched with the taste of the fire. Served warm beside turkey or beef, it felt indulgent without needing to show off. In the early 1900s, it graced both grand dining rooms and humble kitchens, a symbol of refinement that still knew how to comfort. The texture mirrored mashed potatoes, but its taste carried winter's heart, soft, rich, and a little nostalgic. It paired beautifully with gravies and roasts, balancing their depth with quiet sweetness. Making it took time and patience, the kind only holidays allowed. Each spoonful felt like celebration itself, simple, elegant, and timeless. Chestnut puree was food for the soul, a forgotten treasure waiting to be remembered. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. Pumpkin bread is also a Christmas comfort meal that you can find just about anywhere, and it was all the rage during the 70s. Recipes were being published in issues of cooking magazines like Good Housekeeping, which was a pretty big deal then. Anyway, people knew exactly what to do with their winter pumpkin harvest as they preserved the best of the best for Christmas. Most people also seem to think that it originated in Native America or from the Pumpkin Bread Media Cookbook. Either way, let's go over the flavor profile of this delicious bread a bit. You can expect some earthy notes as you bite into what seems to be the perfect holiday snack to start your Christmas with, as well as buttery walnut flavors with a velvety texture. Speaking of breakfasts, have you ever heard of Dippy eggs? Pretty popular little dish, featuring runny yolks as the star of the show, but not something you'd find in any cookbook today. Americans are a little bad when it comes to sanitary practices with food because the runny yolk aspect actually triggered salmonella in some people and a widespread fear in most. Despite how you can actually avert the risk entirely if you just follow the recommended ways to cook it. You pair that with Dippy eggs, taking really precise timing to get that consistency for the yolk, and you get a dish that's more intimidating than it is inviting. Even if people knew how to tune down the risk of catching a grade A disease, they weren't sure if they could nail the timing each and every breakfast. There were a lot easier things to dip your toast in, and they were definitely quicker to prepare. If you were an egg person, there was a plethora of other egg-based dishes you could go for instead, so there was never really much incentive towards this. Cranberry pies were made with fresh cranberries that would be used in either purees or jam fillings, and were always typically featured in tart pies or alongside sugar fillings. Amping up the sweetness factor was what bakers were going for with the cranberry pie, and to sweet tooths all across the nation, the goal was definitely achieved. Even if that came at the cost of some of your favorite pairs of jeans not fitting anymore, the taste was just divine. It was worth it to splurge a bit, pig out, and devour a cranberry pie straight out the oven. A lot of bakeries specialized in this, and it was a moneymaker that drove this. To customers, if a place did not have a cranberry pie, it probably did not have anything else worth eating. Still, cranberry pies are not the litmus test they used to be, and nowadays they are a pretty old-fashioned pie that had their glory days long ago. Carnation instant non-fat dry milk was one of those things Grandma bought weeks before Christmas, and for good reason. It was not just milk, it was insurance. She used it for fudge, pies, puddings, and any recipe that demanded milk when the real thing was already gone. The box sat on her counter, red and white and reliable, a silent promise that no recipe would ever be ruined by shortage. She would mix it into her baking like second nature, measuring without measuring, trusting the habit of her hands. It made everything smoother, richer, more comforting. Sometimes she even added a spoonful to her coffee just because it made her smile. Carnation's powder was part of the rhythm of the season, a symbol of preparation and care. It proved that you did not need much to make Christmas perfect, just foresight, patience, and love. Although potato au gratin originated in 16th century Europe, its roots in the United States can be traced to French-American communities in North America. Gratin refers to a culinary technique where a dish is topped with a browned crust. This can be made using grated cheese or breadcrumbs, or even butter and eggs. In potato au gratin, most of the time people use grated cheese or breadcrumbs to add a crispier crunch to what is already a perfect combo of baked sliced potatoes, cream, and sometimes dates. Think of it as the ultimate version of baked mashed potatoes. Despite sounding fancy, it is actually one of the simplest dishes you can add to your holiday menu. Mock apple pies were maybe the top 5 foods to come out of the Great Depression era. Everything about this pie was meant to imitate the feeling, texture, and taste of a good old-fashioned apple pie, but without the costs of one. In the trenches of the Depression era, basic nutrition and fruits became a rarity, and people really only had so much to work with. What came out of those times were a bunch of copies of very beloved foods that Americans were able to afford just a year or two ago. Mock cuisine soon took over a lot of neighborhoods, and mock apple pies made their home in dozens of fridges. Instead of sliced apples, people used Ritz crackers, and the taste and appearance matched an apple pie almost entirely. especially as folks got better at capturing the essence of one, although of course it could not beat the original, and since people's wallets would start feeling better soon, it disappeared. Celery root mash was the quiet elegance of 1970s holiday dining, where French refinement met American practicality. The rough, knobby root, unassuming and pale, hid a tender heart beneath its coarse skin. Peeled, diced, and simmered until soft, it was mashed with butter, cream, and a touch of salt until it turned smooth and velvety. Its flavor was delicate, a balance between potatoes' richness and celery's brightness, earthy but faintly floral. The first spoonful melted on the tongue, light but satisfying, filling the air with buttery calm. It was served beside roasted duck or beef, bringing refinement without pretense. Magazine spreads of the time praised it as modern, chic, and continental, but beneath its polish lived the same comfort found in any farmhouse mash. Its color was pale ivory, its texture a dream. Every bite felt thoughtful, measured, complete. Celery root mash proved that even the humblest vegetables could become something extraordinary when treated with care, a quiet triumph of simplicity turned sublime. Popovers were these light pastries that needed nothing special at all. You had your eggs, milk, and flour, and then you were pretty much set to go. Seeing these at a table was just as common as seeing those floral print chinas that just about every household had for some reason. But you go to a dinner at anyone's today, and the last thing you'll see is some popovers. Now, why is that? The thing is, they're really easy to mess up. They need preheated pans, a hot oven, and a very detail-oriented cooking process that needs a lot of focus and precision. For the amount of effort and skill that this takes, there's just not enough value to make it a sustainable and reliable option out in the field for most home cooks. They'd rather just make something like pigs in a blanket or muffins and be done with it, especially with how Americans just naturally kept gravitating towards easier and easier food. It goes really well with watching some TV and lazing around, you know? Stuffed prunes wrapped in bacon were the show-stopping little bites of mid-century Christmas tables. Sweet, smoky, and rich enough to steal the spotlight from the main course. Each soft, dark prune was carefully filled with a roasted almond or a small cube of cheese, then wrapped snugly in a strip of bacon. As they roasted in the oven, the bacon fat melted into the fruit, the sugar caramelizing to a deep, glossy brown. The kitchen filled with the sound of gentle sizzles and a scent that balanced sweet and savory perfectly. When they came out of the oven, they glistened, sticky and crisp at once, each one a tiny masterpiece of contrast. The salt of the bacon met the syrupy sweetness of the prune, a combination that felt both indulgent and comforting. Served on toothpicks beside roasts or arranged neatly on holiday platters, they disappeared within minutes. Guests reached for them without even realizing it, smiling as they bit into that warm, tender balance of flavors. Once considered elegant, entertaining food, they now survive mostly in memory, tucked into old cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards. Stuffed prunes wrapped in bacon were small luxuries that proved the holidays didn't need extravagance, just creativity, flavor, and love. Pineapple pudding cakes were also just as easy to make, and the perfect thing to freshen you up on a hot summer day. If you did not feel like pulling out all the stops and making a pudding and cake from the start, you could always use packaged products. Pillsbury sugar cake mixes and instant pudding mixes achieved almost the same effect, really. It makes sense why this cake lasted a lot longer than others, because when a recipe is easy to make with grocery mart substitutes instead of proper ingredients, the crowds are going to love it. After all, it makes the dish really accessible to everybody. When people think of easy to buy and make cakes, they think of your typical chocolate cake. Pineapple pudding cakes, also yellow cakes, were mixed with pineapple juice and cream cheese vanilla fillings. Definitely one of the most revitalizing vintage cakes that we are sad to see gone. Shredded coconut snowflake. Tins were small pieces of joy before the baking even began. Grandma would bring them out with ceremony, their glittering metal lids shining under kitchen lights. The smell of coconut filled the air the second the tin opened, sweet and warm like the promise of snow. She sprinkled it over cakes, rolled it into candy balls, and pressed it gently onto frosting until every dessert Looked like it had been dusted by winter itself. Kids would steal pinches, pretending they were just helping. The tins emptied fast, but they left behind the prettiest desserts you could imagine. By Christmas morning, the counters sparkled with coconut-covered memories, each bite tasting of sugar and nostalgia. Those tins were more than ingredients. They were decorations, relics of a season that glowed even without snow. Sometimes things just get old, and sometimes they just don't work. We've had our fair share of both, and scones with clotted cream and jam are a bit of a mix of the two. Now, US and UK cuisines don't generally tend to mix, even though we've had lots of crossovers in the past now. Scones with cream and jam, at least these ones that would use clotted cream, were the quintessential British snack. If your idea of John, 32 from West Virginia, is somebody in plaid or flannel getting real intimate with a hot dog, then your idea of Martin, 28 from Birmingham, is somebody in a blazer enjoying a scone. It's just what we associate with the people, you know? These scones were something that immigrants from the UK brought on over with them, and don't get me wrong, in their parts of the country where there would be large British-American presences, it definitely was something that got a lot of mileage. In other places, it just wasn't really that much of a hit, and clotted cream wasn't really something a lot of people had access to. Kind of a bummer when your core ingredient ends up being in short supply for the masses, but maybe this one staying a niche secret is a good thing. I'm not the biggest scone fan after all, but this is all about you, so how do you feel about this little treat? As nice as it is, that was a trait that was absent from a lot of the food that you'd commonly associate with the 20th century. Take Johnny cakes, right? Pretty typical boomer dish that's been around for the better part of a century and has made more than a few hundred appearances at tables all over the nation. Yet, it's not here anymore, not at all. And the reason? It went away from mainstream diets because it was seen as old-fashioned. The trend and focus on cornmeal and corn in general dying out as people moved towards more vegetables like greens and sweet potatoes, and a lot more of a focus for wear-oriented baking, which is a step away from how cornmeal was used as a primary ingredient. The pancakes and breads of today are almost exclusively made with wheat. Then there's the whole public perception angle. This dish just isn't seen as luxurious or even endearingly rustic. It's most commonly associated with poor man's food, and that doesn't leave a good impression on people anymore, even though that couldn't be further from the truth. This thing had a lot of regional influence, and it served the people well, but the times haven't been kind to the recipe. Atlanta has given us some great things like Donald Glover's hit Atlanta series, and also one beloved soda, which led to another cherished cake, the Coca-Cola cake. It involved a thick buttermilk chocolate cake and marshmallows which were topped with a cola frosting. Unusually, the cake was frosted while still being warm. You may think this is a dumpster fire of an idea and it tastes terrible, but you would be sorely wrong. In fact, most people were not able to tell Coke was even used in the cake. Talk about sneaky, huh? Honestly, the closest thing we can compare it to is a sheath cake, which has a similar recipe but a few things left out. Coca-Cola cakes were perhaps the best Southern comfort food on many, many nights, but people would eventually move on as different products and mixes came. Turnip puff was comfort disguised as elegance, a soufflé made from what most would throw away. Boiled turnips were mashed smooth, mixed with butter, eggs, and a hint of sugar, then baked until puffed and golden. The texture was airy, the flavor sweet with an earthy edge. It was the kind of dish you found in post-war cookbooks, teaching families how to make do with grace. Turnip puff stood proudly beside roasts and gravies, its soft top trembling as it left the oven. The scent was gentle but welcoming, like a promise that nothing simple had to be dull. Kids might wrinkle their noses, but one bite often changed their minds. It was humble food dressed for celebration, proving that thrift and taste could share the same table. Turnip puff was the quiet star of forgotten holiday meals. Snowdrift. Vegetable shortening was not glamorous, but to Grandma it was gold. She trusted that white can more than any fancy new butter or oil. It made pie crusts flaky, cookies soft, and cakes impossibly light. The can itself looked festive, simple and proud, a kitchen staple that carried its weight in Christmas spirit. Grandma measured it with her eyes, scooping it cleanly and smoothing it with the back of a knife like a ritual. When her pies came out of the oven, golden and perfect, everyone understood why she swore by it. Snowdrift was the kind of ingredient that held up families and traditions at once. It was steady, humble, and completely irreplaceable. Sock-it-to-me cakes were probably the vanilla lover's equivalent to a tunnel of fudge. Just like the former, everything about this cake amplified the sweet vanilla flavor. In the 1970s, buttery elements in desserts were really common, and most pastries, cakes, or desserts of any kind had heavy notes of butter in their overall taste. At the time, fruity flavors like rhubarbs and blackberries had taken just a bit of a back seat, and instead, others grew, especially flavors like vanilla and pecan. Sock-it-to-me cakes took those two tried and tested pillars of cake making and mixed them with a cinnamon streusel in the center. What you had then was a deliciously tender, moist, and rich cake that was perfect in just about any season and easily available. In the 70s, they definitely had a very memorable run, but as America kept changing its tastes, this recipe went in the closet. Cranberry orange congealed salad was color and sparkle on a winter plate. You mixed tart cranberries with orange zest, sugar, and cloves, folding everything into bright red gelatin until it shimmered like stained glass. It chilled in molds shaped like rings, wreaths, or hearts, depending on the occasion. When turned out, it quivered perfectly, cool and festive. Each slice tasted sharp and sweet, a burst of fruit against heavy meats and gravies. The orange gave brightness, the cloves a whisper of spice. It looked fancy, even when made from pantry staples. In the 1950s, it was the pride of the table, a bridge between salad and dessert. Served with whipped cream or plain, it reminded everyone that beauty could be edible. Cranberry orange congealed salad was nostalgia on a plate, wobbly, bright, and full of cheer. So, braised veal with olives was a staple in English menus in the 18th century. This Mediterranean-inspired dish involved slow-cooking veal with a combination of olives, tomatoes, garlic, and white wine, resulting in a tender, flavorful meal. Similar dishes are familiar in the cuisines of other countries, including France, Italy, Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic. This dish was often served with crusty bread or mashed potatoes and was a hit at potlucks. So, why did this one fade away into history? Well, look around. Who eats veal anymore? Not me. But if your grandparents are ever craving a delicious bite of their childhood, you might want to whip this up for them. Jarred minced meat filling was both mysterious and magnificent. Grandma always bought it early, long before the stores filled with shoppers. She would hold that glass jar like a treasure, the dark filling inside glistening with fruit and spice. No one really knew what went into it, and she never explained, only calling it her Christmas magic. The smell was unmistakable once it hit the pie shell: apples, raisins, cinnamon, and something deeper, something that felt ancient. Her mince pies were not for everyone, but the ones who loved them swore they tasted like memory itself. It was sweet, warm, and a little grown up. Every Christmas, that jar connected her to generations before her, the kind of tradition that needed no recipe card. In the 2010s, and I'm sure a lot of you can remember this, standing rib roasts were the undisputed top dog. It seemed like a complete 180 too. It felt like the general stance went from, "We need keto, our kids need to eat more vegetables," back to as much McDonald's as a human stomach can possibly contain. Somewhere along the line, standing rib roasts became the ideal Christmas meal. It had already been a staple for so long in American culture, so it wasn't like people were doing anything that was very innovative or new, but the 2000s have been full of attempts at reviving old culture and bringing back dishes and cooking practices from the 20th century as much as they've been about exploring new frontiers. With rib roasts, there was this need for a return to classic comfort foods that people had grown up with. A lot of Americans also grew up on the things we were discussing previously, namely canned, processed food, and they had forgotten the simple joy of working with whole cuts of meat. Orange slice candy for fruitcake was the sparkle in Grandma's baking. Sticky, bright, and cheerful, those little candies brought life to every loaf. She would slice them with care, mixing them with nuts and raisins until her kitchen looked like a stained glass window in motion. The scent was citrus and sugar and something purely Christmassy. No one could resist sneaking a piece from the mixing bowl. When the fruitcakes came out of the oven, golden and heavy with sweetness, you could see the candies glowing through the crumb. They were simple, affordable, and perfect, a treat that turned practicality into art. Grandma never made just one fruitcake either. She made several, each packed with those orange gems because she knew they would not last long. In every slice, there was joy that money could not buy. If these 1980s Christmas party foods brought back the sparkle of old holiday nights, comment your favorite memory, like the video, and subscribe so we can keep serving nostalgia one bite at a time.